this right here was the impetus for us being here tonight. This very comic was my introduction to Conan the Barbarian. Through this comic, then to the work of Robert E. Howard. My college classmate, Charlie Williams, really outstanding cartoonist. I'm sitting in a class with him and seeing him drawing cartoons instead of taking notes. And I said, we were talking about comics. My conscience speaks. We're talking about comics. And I said, I gave my comics, baseball cards, and other kid stuff to my little brother when they went to Atlanta. And he came into our next class session, and he plopped this onto my desk, and he said, read that and tell me it's kid stuff. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the opening scene, you start out above the thieves' quarter, and you slowly descend through the panels, and you turn the page, and you're in the tavern. It caught me, captured me, and I've been with it ever since. I was hooked. Soon I was immersing myself in Conan paperbacks and then anything else I could find by Howard. The Conan comic inspired a teenager named Tim Marion to start the Robert E. Howard United Press Association, an amateur press group, in 1972. I joined them in 1980. 6 years later, I convinced 9 other members, including Bill Cavalier, to come down here and join me on a trip to Cross Plains. The friendships that we developed here with members of Project Tribe and the Friends of the Library have led to the organization's purchase of the Howard House, the creation of Robert E. Howard Days, and here we are in a direct line from that fatal day in spring of 1971 in Religious Studies 3030. Roy Thomas was, of course, the writer of this comic, and the driving force behind Marvel's introduction to this comic book, Conan the Barbarian, in 1970. And for 10 years and 115 issues, in collaboration with artists such as Barry Windsor Smith, Gil Kane, John Buscema, and others, he set the standard for the depiction of Howard's Sumerian hero in a visual medium. The award-winning comic spawned many others, and through such magazines as Savage Tales, Savage Sword of Conan, Conan the Barbarian, Skull the Conqueror, and many others, Roy introduced thousands of new readers to Conan and to Howard's other characters and stories, including King Cole, Solomon Kane, Bran McMorn, and various of the horror tales. In addition, his constant reminders to his readers that these stories were based on the work of Robert E. Howard, and his addition of nonfiction articles about Howard and his work by eminences such as Fred Blosser, helped introduce them to the originals and contributed to the growth of Howard fandom and the Howard boom of the 1970s. Roy's involvement with Conan and Robert E. Howard continues to the present day with television screenwriting credits, comics, and books such as his Barbarian Life series, chronicling the stories behind the Conan comics issue by issue. Roy's career has been far more than just Conan, of course. He's worked not only for Marvel, but for DC, Charlton, Cross Plains Comics, Dark Horse, Dynamite, Burst, Heroic Publishing, Topps. He has created or co-created characters you might recognize or have heard of, like Wolverine, Vision, Carol Danvers, who's Ms. Marvel or Captain Marvel, Iron Fist, Ultron, the Defenders, Man-Thing, a host of others, including a flame-tressed sword woman by the name of Red Sonja, originally based on Howard's 16th century Sonja with a Y. Roy's won far too many awards for us to run down here. They include 3 Shazam Awards and 6 Goethe, I try to pronounce that correctly, Comic Art Fan Awards, induction in 2011 into the Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame, and in 2006, induction into the prestigious Black Circle of the Robert E. Howard Foundation. Finally, let me note that Roy is not only a legendary comic book professional, he is also a legendary fan. He edited 4 issues of the comics fan magazine Alter Ego in the 1960s before going to work for Marvel. Then he took on the editorship again when the magazine was revived in 1998 and is still going strong with Volume 3, number 170, due out soon. we are delighted to have as our guest of honor in this special year the man who helped launch Robert E. Howard into popular media and on to worldwide fame, and who probably did not imagine back in 1970 that we would be here tonight welcoming him to Robert E. Howard's hometown. Roy Thomas.
Yeah, that's good. I talk pretty loud, but I'll just yank this thing off. I don't know, I feel a little strange because I know that the real center of all this, the reason that everybody's here and should be here, the reason this thing has existed for all these last 3 to 4 decades has nothing to do with me or the comics as such. It's it's Robert E. Howard who's the fountain of all this kind of material. It was my privilege, my good luck, a little bit of smarts too. I don't know, put myself down entirely, but really there was a lot of luck involved of getting the rights to do Conan. And at the time, no, I didn't think anything about it. Now, how many of you were at the thing this afternoon? Okay, well, I said a little this before, and I tried to avoid saying too much. So I said, I don't give speeches, but I said, one thing I can talk about forever because I've had to tell the story so many times because it's kind of weird, is what they titled When Conan Went Public, because it's sort of how Marvel got into the game. Because pretty much, I would suspect almost everybody here knows what had happened before that. I mean, they know that in the 30s, Howard got this idea, for Conan, and so was the Weird Tales. How after he died so, tragically young, the character kind of, was kind of lost for a few years, and then a guy named Marty Greenberg started publishing them in hardcover with his Gnome Press and so forth, and then somewhere along the line, and for whatever you think of it, L. Sprague de Camp got himself attached to it, in good ways and bad perhaps, but he did lead to there being this Lancer series of paperbacks that came out in 1966, and they were going to have one of the best lucky strokes, along with whatever contacts de Camp made, at just the right time when there had been Edgar Rice Burroughs was selling, Doc Savage was selling, and Tolkien was out as paperback for the first time. That just about at that same time, the publishers, they needed a cover for the book, and they went to the guy they thought would be perfect for them because he drew a lot of stuff of that material. A wonderful artist named Roy Krenkel, right? A lot of you know his work, and he's fantastic. But he said, I've done a lot of Conan stuff, but there's somebody else that should really do this, and so forth. He didn't feel like up to it or quite right or something. So he said, there's this guy, he'd been doing covers of Tarzan and other Burroughs books and a few other things here and there. His name is Frank Frazetta. And yeah, right. And somehow, Frank had been doing great work on the Tarzan covers, I think, but somehow the combination that came together of his cover, especially that very first image, and the material inside, and people started to read it, just set things off. Later on, Conan could keep going, and Robert E. Howard keep going, and didn't necessarily need Frazetta anymore, and Frazetta didn't need Howard to keep going in his own direction. But at the time, it was a perfect marriage, and I don't think any other artist ever in comics or in any other field, on the screen or anywhere else, ever caught the image of what Conan should be and what we all think of as Conan any better than, and maybe not as well as, Frazetta. So where the comics came in, I hadn't read that stuff. I wasn't a fan of that kind of stuff. I bought the book for the cover, and it said on the back, that's 1966, I was 25, working for Marvel Comics for about a year, and I bought the book, and it said on the back something about Atlantis. So I thought it's sort of in the vein of like, the John Carter of Mars stuff, or one of the Burroughs things. And I bought all that stuff at the time. I didn't even remember that I had bought a couple of years early Almuric, which was the first Robert E. Howard paperback, and I never read that either, I just knew it was a copy of John Carter of Mars. And I read a few pages of it, and it was just this guy who throws this princess over his shoulder, and and so forth, and some wizard kills his men, and it was good. The prose was all right, but it just didn't grab me exactly. It wasn't what I was looking for. It wasn't what I thought it was going to be. So I just set it on the shelf. Never touched it again for 2 or 3 years. But in the meantime, the other paperbacks would come out, and they had these wonderful. The first few had the wonderful Frazetta covers, and well, I'll keep buying for those. Maybe sometime I'll actually read this stuff. And the first thing I ever read, actually, which also had a Frazetta cover, which I owned the original oil of for a few years, was an imitation, half John Carter and half Conan, called Fangor by Lynn Carter. It was Fangor in the City of Magicians, and it was behind this wonderful Frazetta cover of a Conan-like hero riding a pterodactyl above a sea of lava against a black background. Just wonderful, one of my favorite Frazetta images. And but people were writing into Marvel and saying, you should get one of these characters. They didn't necessarily, some said Conan, some just said and they didn't tell us to make up one. It was more like telling us to get the rights to one of the characters from the books. Because otherwise Marvel usually made up its own characters. And I don't know why we didn't do it again, and I'm glad we didn't. But, because we couldn't have done anything, as well as the original. And so we were smart, boy. First thing we did is I told Stan, well, there's Thongor, and there's Conan, and there's another character. By this time, that paperback had come out with the Kringle cover, Kull. And Stan said, well, the name I like best for comics is Thongor. Thongor sounds like a comic book character. And the second one was Kull. And the third was Conan, because, a C doesn't look as good as like a K, a nice strong K, So, but anyway, for that and the fact that I had actually read the Thongor book before I read it, Eddie Conan all the way through, so we went after Thongor, Actually, I had to write a memo first to the publisher to tell him why we should do this book. I said, write a 2 or 3 page memo to our publisher, who I didn't know, didn't speak to ever, telling us why we should do a sword and sorcery book and license one of these characters. Not why we should just do the book, but why we should license the characters. So I wrote this memo and said, well, it's got strong heroes like our heroes. It's got good-looking women, mostly dressed for tropical climates. It's got, monsters and wizards. I sort of slid over the fact that it looked like it took place in, 1066 or something like that, because I thought that would not necessarily appeal to the publisher. So he authorized me to offer a total, without any royalty at any time, of $150 per issue, which is a lot more money in 1970, or 69, 70, than it was it is today, but it still wasn't a king's ransom. So I talked to Lynn Carter, and he loved comics. He thought that'd be just fun, but he had an agent who was a businessman, of course. His businessman said $150 an issue for this thing. They're going to maybe sell several 100,000 copies and whatever. So he kept stalling for time. He kept waiting, somehow thinking that Marvel was going to up his offer. I could have told him this publisher is never going to up his offer one dime, So I just waited, got more frustrated. And finally, while I was waiting and getting frustrated, Stan would say, is there any progress? I said, no, I haven't heard from the agent, and so forth. And one night, I had to go down and somewhere, I think post office, to probably drop off something. I stopped off at a store, and there was the latest Conan book. I guess this was 69. It was the Conan of Samaria book, the one that has the frost giant cover. Beautiful cover. And for the first time, I'd read some of the stories by this time and really liked it, but I felt Conan was probably out of our league. This is the big character. It's selling very well. We do in paperback, so we're not going to be able to get that for $150 a page. So better lucky we get Fondor. And but I saw this, and for the first time that I can remember, I read the L. Sprague de Camp. So L. Sprague de Camp didn't like the comic later. He had owned himself to blame. He said right at the end, he says, that he mentions this guy named Glenn Lord, who is the literary agent for the Robert E. Howard estate. Well, I'm working for a publishing company, even if it's comics. I don't need a house to follow me to tell me that, if somebody is listed as the agent for the estate, maybe that's the guy to contact and see if we can get the rights, instead of going to L. Sprague de Camp, who I figured I'd heard enough about it to know that probably wasn't going to work. And so I just dropped Glenn Lord. You know, we didn't have phones too expensive in those days, no other way to do it. So I just dropped him a letter. 2 days later, about a week later, an answer comes back. But I was so embarrassed when I wrote this letter. $150 just stuck in my craw. So it was so low. So I upped it to 200, you know, on my own, a 33 to 30% increase, just because I was so embarrassed at the 150. So he accepts and says, okay, send a contract. You can't use any Conan stories that, you know, but you can use Howard. You can't adapt anything, but you can use the character. And I said, so we made okay, and the lawyers took care of this very simple contract, which I, you know, didn't have much to do with. And then I was about to hand it off to somebody else, my young friend Jerry Conway or somebody else to write, because I was, you know, busy writing the Avengers and the Hulk or, you know, other things like that. And then I thought, what am I going to do if that our publisher, who was notoriously cheap, remembered, as he probably would and did, that I had offered him more money, and he was going to take that $50 out of my hide. So the only way I could get him to do anything with it was to decide, I'll write the first issue or so, instead of giving it off to someone else. I'll write the first issue or so that if he remembers it, I can just not get paid for 1 or 2 issues that'll come out even, you know. I probably had to go without being paid for 2 or 3 pages at my rate at that time in order to make up the $50. But, so I did. And so then it was fine. And we had just the right person. Everything's going along okay. And I started working on a plot, an original story. At that time, we didn't ever have formal rights at that time to do a particular story. I arranged that a little later, in kind of a personal way with Glenn. And I worked on the story, and we had our ideal artist. His name was John DeSimone, you know, who was going to be the Conan artist. And John had never heard of Conan, but when I sent him 1 or 2 of the paperbacks, he said, I've been wanting to do this kind of stuff all my life. This is the kind of thing I want to do. I don't like these superheroes anyway. And since John was one of the best draftsmen ever in the Street Comics, if you're familiar with his work, that was just wonderful. And then reality struck in. The publisher woke up and looked at this contract. What's this $200 thing here? You know, he says, you know, that's so much money. He says, we got to get that money back. So he says, you can't have a top-rate artist. You know, maybe it's $40, $50 a page for pencils, whatever the rate was at the time. I'm not sure. And he says, you got to get a cheap artist to do this book because I got to get my money back, you know, for the license. So that ruled out not only John DeSimone, but also my new friend, another fine comic artist, Bill Kane, who had heard of Robert E. Howard probably before I was born, and so forth, and who really wanted to do Conan. He had been trying to arrange for it at one time. And he was ruled out because his rate was too high. I rejected a couple of people Stan suggested because I just felt they were good artists, but I thought, no, they're not good. He said, well, then you got to find somebody cheap and good, fast, or they're going to do it. So I got busy, and I thought, well, there's this bratty kid, about 20, 21 years old, who Barry Smith, over in the east end of London, who had come over here, done a little work for Marvel. They discovered he didn't have a little thing called a green card or anything like that. He shouldn't have been working in these States. They gave him 24 hours to get back to London or be thrown in jail. And we'd been having him do work long distance, and I had done a little story of a kind of a Conan-esque character, one little 7-page story about a character I called Star the Slayer with him, and it worked out okay. So I said, well, you know, I don't want to use these other guys because they're not special enough. Barry's kind of crude, but he's got a lot of energy, and I've seen him draw stuff like this. He can kind of do it. So I got him on the phone, we sent him that plot, and he drew it, and, you know, and the rest is kind of history. Eventually, by the time Barry left, a couple of years later, it was selling well enough we could get John DeSimone to come in and be the artist, and it actually, as great as Barry's stuff was, it sold just as well under Bill Cade, and even better under DeSimone. By 75, 76, it had become one of Marvel's best-selling comics. When they did those medallions, they did some kind of medallions that some outside author did. The 3 characters they wanted to do that Marvel could get the rights to were Spider-Man, Hulk, and Conan, rather than, say, the Fantastic Four or somebody else. And, you know, it's kind of nice to see that. So, so I wrote those 10 years of Conan, and eventually I worked out some special deals with Glenn, because I just wanted to kind of do those original Conan stories, especially, and so forth. So I worked out a deal with Glenn, and somehow, I don't know why, because it was selling for a couple of issues or something before it dipped and then came up again. I got some sort of deal so that I didn't have to pay myself, to pay the extra money, $50, $100, whatever it was, to adapt, stories like Tower of the Elephant, which is the first one we adapted, and then we adapted another story. That was the what was it called? Had several different titles. The Gray God Passes was the one title. To turn a non-Conan story into a Conan story, the way DeCamp had been doing in other things. We ended up publishing that one first, but Tower of the Elephant was done first. And it was really Tower of the Elephant. I can still remember the night, I think I got home from somewhere, my first wife and I, and this package had come in from England. And I opened it up, and here was this beautiful pencil work telling the story just as he and I had worked it out. I didn't give him, it's a story he read, plus I gave him a written plot on top of it. And the whole scene that you described, and I think I changed the order of 2 panels about how I introduced Conan. I cut them out and repasted, but otherwise, it's perfect. And that was my favorite Conan story then and now. I think I adapted it. I adapted it twice in the comics, once in the comic strip, and once for an old-time radio style record. So I got a lot of mileage out of Tower of the Elephant. And that's sort of how Conan, went public. And but it led to the movies, and it led to a lot of other things. But of course, the root of all of it is Robert E. Howard, who didn't really create a character that I was just too stupid to recognize in those first few pages. I just didn't realize how good that stuff, really was. Maybe it'd been a different story. I don't know. Maybe it'd been Tower of the Elephant. I might have got into it sooner because I had more sorcery and stuff that I think I might have got to it sooner. But I made up for lost time. And I was good for Conan. Conan was certainly good for me and for Marvel Comics. And I did, even though we didn't have to by contract, I did always add Robert E. Howard's name into the stories because I wanted people to read the original stories too. I mean, nobody was asking this. I just thought it'd be a good idea to do it. I felt people should. And when we got the Black and White magazine, I was able to hire people like Fred Blosser, who had written some stuff for Glenn, and a few other people, Lynn Carter even, and Glenn Warren himself, to write articles for that, so that ostensibly it was the same money. The page of type was cheaper than the page of artwork, and that's why I had to do it. But I just used that as an excuse. I always felt like, the stuff that we could do would be as good as the Amber fanzine, for the most part, was doing. I believed that then, and I believe it now. And I think we kind of proved that. I was very disappointed when I left after 10 years. They sort of immediately discontinued the idea of Conan as anything except a comic book. That kind of disappointed me because I thought we had something, a little more for about a decade there. But anyway, that's the whole story. Now it's all over. I just wanted to have we'd take about 10 or 15 minutes to take a few questions or something, because I don't give speeches and so if anybody has a question that will be fairly simply answered, that doesn't involve why didn't Jack Kirby draw a Conan. Actually, I wouldn't have minded that either, but I don't think I could have adjusted him having a ray gun. So anyway, yes, over there.
Roy, Conan started comics in 1970 before the direct sale comic book factory store situation came up. How do you feel Conan worked in helping evolve that?
How did I do that?
The comic book factory store?
Yeah. Oh, the store?
And such, as opposed to the old distribution.
No, it was just another comic book as far as we were, as far as Stan would have been concerned, and me too for the most part. I mean, I knew it was handled differently, and it was going for a little different audience. Perhaps, some of the same, we were trying to reach the same audience that liked Thor and the Hulk, but we were trying to reach it with a little different material, which I thought was related to it, but wasn't exactly the same, I mean, there are heroes that are, no stronger than Conan, Captain America, Batman, they're not all guys with superpowers. So, but, we just treated it like another comic book. It was dumped out in the stands. And as I said this afternoon, the first issue sold quite well. And the next 7, each one sold worse than the one before it, until Stan said, you got too many animals on the cover. You know, and with the next cover, we put on these 7, 8 foot skeletons in armor. The sales went up. The next issue, we had this guy, the flying guy in the Garden of Fear story. That sold well. And within a short time, the Sons said, well, we can actually afford John Gasimpus to do the book when Barry left. And so forth. So, you know, that's all it was. But it was just treated like another, you know, comic book as far as we were concerned. Yes, Dan, I recognize. What? Oh, yeah, that's kind of funny, yeah. I deliberately wanted to make Conan different in certain ways. Not for the sake of doing it, but it just seemed like it was a little different from the Hulk and different from, you know, the other books. So I did 2 things consciously from the very beginning, but I didn't mention the Stan because that would ask permission, and you know, and I did that, he's likely to say no. But I figured by 1970, I've been working there 5 years. I'm sort of associate editor. He had told people long ago, just show me the first and last page of any story you write. If they're okay, I'll figure the middle is okay too. And we did okay after that. So he wasn't paying too much attention to any of this stuff. So I decided 2 things. One, Stan, if you've read Marvel comics, especially the early ones, you know Stan Lee liked sound effects. You know, splat, blang, you know, and he lettered them himself. The letters that looked like they were artistic to these people. I was actually just then sort of tracing Stan's very dramatic things that he had lettered right on the original art. But I thought, you know, I didn't like the idea of that kind of sound effect in Conan. So I decreed that there would be no non-verbal sound effects. If somebody yelled, there might, you know, or if an animal growled or roared, I'd do that. But I wasn't going to have any sound effects like bang or batak or whatever. And the other thing was, I felt like it wasn't like you didn't get inside Conan at all, but I felt like somehow I didn't want thought balloons. Thought balloons were very big, not now, but they were at that time. Stan loved the thought balloons. Everybody was thinking, oh, my darling, you know, and all this stuff, you know, and I must do this, I must do that. I decided if they were going to figure out how Conan was thinking, they were either going to do it from captions, which were a little less direct, or they were going to do it from just seeing the pictures, so I didn't have any thought balloons. That worked okay for a few months, because Stan never read the comic book anyway. So he didn't notice. And it worked well until we started Cull the Conqueror #1 a few months later. And that starts with this parade and so forth, you know, and it's kind of quiet, because it's a big parade of Cull, the Red Slayers and the people coming down the street. And Stan sees that, and he pays attention to that somehow, because it's a new book. And he says, you know, this is a little quiet. You know, it says, and look, here's where Cull stops somebody, he swings the sword, and why don't you put a big splat in there? And I said, I don't do sound effects in the comic. He looked at me, you know, as if I had just told him that I, you know, drowned kittens for a week. You know? And then he said something about thoughts. He said, well, maybe you should show what he's thinking. You know, I said, well, I don't use thought balloons in the Conan and Cull, you know, comics. Another look at the same time. He said, well, you know, all right, you know, but he didn't force me to do it. He respected my taste, and luckily enough, with his help in those certain ways, we turned the thing around and so forth, and he left me alone. I think there's one sound effect in my 10-year run. When Neil Adams was doing something, I think in the adaptation of what's the one, about the man who's Zambula, Shadows over Zambula. And I think there was some door opening, and Neil let a little tiny click, which I didn't see. And I let it go. Every time I look at it, I say, man, you stick it by me, or I would take it an eraser to it or something. But it's okay. Now when I would do the Conans, I throw in a few sound effects, because that's the way they are, and I'm not the editor anymore. But it was just, I just felt Conan was a little different. It wasn't like I had thought it out intellectually. It was just that's a very good question, ma'am. You know, I should marry you.
Are there any interesting stories about those what-if issues that brought Conan into the present day?
Well, I only did the first one, you know, because except for, as I forgot to mention, except for showing, I think, Peter Parker, Mary Jane, or something in the past, I wouldn't have any heroes, you know, any of the Marvel heroes in the book or anything like that. The later what-ifs that did have, one or two were done by other people after I left. But I just thought it'd be kind of fun to bring him in, and I had done this story about a citadel at the center of time, and so it was just kind of fun. And so I thought, well, if Conan fell into this, he might end up in the 20th century. And about a year or so earlier, they had this second blackout. I'd been around in '65 for the one then, but the one in the 70s was more violent. The world had kind of changed a little in those 12 years. And so I thought, well, that'd be a good time for Conan to be around. So I had him arrive in the middle of this blackout and cut up a few gangers, you know, and so forth. And the thing I was happiest about, I guess, you know, you need something to, you know, make you feel that you're enjoying the story and it's, you know, something special. There's some little touch you want to do. The two touches that I did that I liked was the original story had taken place in, you know, one of the lands that probably Shem or whatever, that resembles ancient Babylonia to some extent, you know, Samaria, that kind of thing. The land of ziggurats. And I was thinking, you know, and I remembered what looks like a ziggurat. And of course, I lived not too many blocks away from the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which was always said, still is, to look like an inverted ziggurat, an upside down ziggurat. So when this, and then I had the other nice inspiration, which was I decided to get the artist to model this woman that Conan met when he comes, a taxi driver who he met when he came into the 20th century after my girlfriend, Danette, later Dan, and and John Buscema, and even more so the inker, Ernie Chan, made it look just like the photographs I had sent of Dan. And just to maybe sell a few extra copies, the cover that has Conan and Dan on the cover has a Star Wars poster in the background. And I can't tell you how many times I've been offered money for that thing, mainly because there's a Star Wars poster on top of Conan and so forth, and I just thought it'd be kind of funny to show the contrast between Conan and, you know, the modern day thing. And so I had a lot of fun with that. And my favorite scene was when Conan and Dan are sitting across from each other, and she's saying, they don't understand each other's language. She's saying, where did you come from? And says, and he sort of understands enough to draw a ziggurat. And of course, she's sitting across the table from him, so she sees it upside down. Says, "You came from the Guggenheim Museum?" You know, so they go there and they get involved in something. You know, so it was just a lot of fun. And the thing about that is, not that I or my fellow writers, artists, you know, always come up with these genius things. So that isn't it. But you know, when you just start thinking about the possibilities of something, you have a good character, you have a good world. Conan created that world, or Robert Howard created that world, Conan and so forth. It presents possibilities to you. You know, you see that and you feel like, you know, you just want to do things with that world. That was the genius of the jump from the Cole stories, which were certainly very good, into the world of Conan, where you suddenly have worlds right away and you see their names, you sort of know what they are. You know, one of them is Egypt, and one of them is Rome, and one of them is this, and one of them is that, and they're all put together and mixed in a blender. You know, and that's the Hyborian age, and it's not too consistent. Somehow the trade thing doesn't exactly work. There's way too many landlocked countries and only about one ocean for about 4 different groups of pirates. You know, but still, you know, if you sort of, you know, you have to kind of squint a little bit, but it works because it was just an excuse for Howard to tell a good story. He never worried. I don't think even if he drew a map, he never worried that much about making it totally. You know, work as a world exactly. It worked enough for his stories. That was what he cared about. It's up to the people later, the L. Sprague de Camps, the Roy Thomases, the John Millises of the world. It's up to these other people to come along and make order out of it and try to make it a consistent thing. Howard was too busy creating the stuff to worry about all the little, you know, as my friends used to say, sweat the small stuff. You know. Anything else? Want you more before you get to go? Yes.
Yeah, you shared earlier this afternoon about how you felt about working with Neil Adams briefly. But I was curious how you felt about working with Barry Smith, because I really thought that y'all really clicked and really close.
It was wonderful. It was really wonderful. You know, we had a really good relationship, you know, until about 3 minutes after he left Marvel and everything. And he then decided, of course, he had actually done everything. And of course, he certainly did a lot, my God. He just grew wonderfully and developed in all sorts of strange ways we couldn't have seen and we're very happy with. But then he decided he was being exploited by Marvel Comics. I said, well, of course you're being exploited by Marvel Comics. We're all being exploited. Stan Lee even is being exploited by Marvel. He doesn't own those characters. We're all being exploited. You know, you cash your checks and shut up, you know. So he went off and he made a name for himself. It turned out to be Windsor, actually. And he just a wonderful artist, but, you know, I don't think we're destined to have lunch together ever again. But other than that, I think he's just a wonderful talent. You know, the two most difficult artists I ever worked with were Neil Adams and Barry Smith, and they're two of the best. You know, and everything. Just like Stan Lee, the best artist he ever worked with, Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, and you know how those worked out. I mean, you know, it's, you know, the only thing you can be sure about in a partnership, even an unequal one, like so where I was the editor, and so the only thing you can ever be sure about in any partnership is that each partner did 90% of the work. That's the only thing you know. If you don't believe it, ask them. You know. Anything else? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On your work with any of the Howard properties, was there ever an artist you really wanted to work with but weren't able to? You can remember?
I really would have liked to see Jack Kirby draw his Conan story once, but he did one drawing, and John had and Stan had John Romita redraw the head. I don't know. Obviously, yeah, Joe Kubert over at DC, who's one of my, you know, in some ways my favorite artist. Certainly up there with Jack, you know, and so forth. His Hawkman, his Tor the Caveman in the 50s were, so to me, some of the very best comics ever done, especially Tor. And I wanted to work with him. Stan had a weird view once. I says, you know, all the people in DC, and there was, you know, Inventino, Gills, back there sometime, a lot of good artists. There's one artist I'd like to get over here, Joe Kubert. He says, but I want to have somebody else ink it. Now, those of you who don't know Joe Kubert's work will know how funny it is, because 90% of Joe's work is in the ink. He does about a squiggle of pencils, then he inks. If we had hired him as a penciler, we'd have got nothing. You know? But that would have been one of the people I would most want to work with if I could. I think he did do a tiny bit of Conan later on, as did his two sons who became professional artists. And so a few other people I wouldn't have minded, but I got most of the ones I really wanted at the time. Of course, that's not counting all the wonderful people who have come along since then. There were some good guys after I left the 80s. There were Gary Kaspwizik, or however you pronounce his name, and 2 or 3 others who did really fine work, but I never got a chance to work with them. There's somebody over there, yes.
So one of the things that's different from comics in the 70s and 80s versus now is that you guys were, you and like Mark Wolfman and Claremont were a lot more text heavy. It felt like you were trying to get as much story in as you could. Was there kind of an editorial mandate to try to make it more like an illustrated story, or was it on that, or was it now where it's lighter, or?
No, there was no mandate to make things text heavy. It was a combination of 2 or 3 things. One is that Stan had gradually gotten a little text heavier with all the thought balloons and the motivation he wanted to do. He certainly believed in more, you know, whatever text he would put. And since he was writing the actual dialogue after the pictures had been drawn from his plot, or the artist's plot, or a combination thereof, he could put balloons anywhere that he wanted to. You know, if you write a script in advance, the artist is going to make all the balloons float to the top like they're, you know, filled with helium, you know, which is fine. But Stan would say, well, you know, I can put a little shark balloon in this armpit, you know, or something. And sometimes it would be too much, and I followed some of his bad habits in that. But at the same time, it also paid me sometimes to have a whole little conversation, and it was a more literary approach. I don't think it's necessarily better or worse. You know, it's just a different approach to comics. I was also influenced by my friend Gil Kane, who of course wrote some of the very first graphic novels and illustrated books with his Black Mark and other things. And he was another person who believed, you know, in text heavy, that, you know, captions, you should use captions. I'll admit, I've got nothing against the occasion the comics that don't have any captions. It's all just dialogue. But to me, comics are not movies. And I don't see any reason why not to have a narrative voice. You know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But it was left to the individual person, and we all made, you know, different ways. Now times have changed, and now they don't use very many captions anymore. You know, I'm not even going to mention what I think of that. but if it works as comics, it works as comics. You know, every generation gets the comic books it deserves. And it's okay. You know. I look back at some of the stuff I did, I say I wrote too much copy and this and that and so forth, and I'd like to go back and take out about, you know, even 10%, somebody else might say 30%, you know. But it worked, it sold comics for the most part, and, you know, that's the proof of the pudding. Whatever else we were doing, whether I was trying to sell little Robert E. Howard or do Have Fun, is that, you know, we were in the business of selling comic books, making our publisher happy, whether it was an individual man or a conglomerate. And in order to do that, we had to, you know, we had to make a move off the stands. If we didn't do that well enough, we had to go into some other field. I had to go back to high school teaching, which I had always hated. Last couple questions, I should go. I saw 1 or 2 other. Yes.
Did you ever have any trouble with the comic store? You have to reach
Yeah, Conan in the comics code, you know, that little thing that said, you know, no werewolves, vampires, no exit wounds, no this, no that. And also, also, by the way, anything else we think that isn't quite fitting, we'll cut that out too. The elastic clause of the whole thing. Yeah, but I like the guy who was a lawyer who was in charge of the time, a guy named Len Darvin, a nice guy. Stan didn't like him or respect him too much, but I liked him, and he'd tell me, you know, he told me a few years later when I sort of sensed it, you know, I let you do a lot of stuff in Conan and I wouldn't let get by in the other comics because he felt they had an older audience, so it was a little different sensibility, and I gave him credit for that. But, you know, sometimes we had trouble, like when we did this story, we adapted The Frost Giant's Daughter, right? One of the classic Howard Conan stories. He was rejected for years. And, you know, there's a lot of nudity in it because it was semi-nudity in various things and a little other things because it was to be published in black and white in a comic that was not a coded comic. So then when Barry left the first time of a couple there, that he left, we both wanted to publish that in color. And of course the comics code just threw it back at it. We had to change a lot of words. We had to, you know, we had to cover up all this, the gossamer, that this Frost Giants, all of a sudden it was more like Burlap, you know, and things like that. And, you know, and sometimes they would make me something at the end if it didn't look like it looked like Conan had done something and he wasn't going to get punished. I said, well, he gets caught and thrown in prison the next issue. He says, yeah, but the reader won't know that, so you got to say at the end he's going to get caught and thrown in prison next issue. So I had to do that. And once when in Rogues of the House, he beheads a priest, the priest of whoever, whatever priest he beheads. We couldn't quite show that, so Barry came up with a very interesting thing of showing the head, and this guy was very corpulent, so if he was lying there, you know, you'd have seen his body, well, you didn't see the body, so it was sort of the way of saying he was beheaded, you know, without showing it, and we sneaked it past. But my favorite thing was a color thing. In the Garden of Fear story, this winged monster carries this, you know, one of the native characters before Conan comes in and drops him from a great height into these flowers, this field of white flowers. Now, I don't remember if this is in Howard's story exactly or not. It probably is, but anyway, the thing was that the flowers obviously kind of devoured him. So, and of course, you know, the code was not real big on devouring, you know. So, you know, and blood or anything. So, when I talked to the colorist, a woman named Mimi Gold, who was going with Barry at the time, had helped arrange for him to get back in the country. I said, look, here's 3 panels of these. It's like the same shot 3 times in a row that Barry had drawn. That I walked through my drawing. I says, just don't. I didn't put ordinarily we would write little color notes in the margins, which would then, you know, not be printed. But the code would have seen them. They would say, you know, color this white. And I wanted to show I was to white, to pink, to red in the 3 panels, showing that it was taking this guy's blood, the flowers and plants that turned from white to red over the 3 panels. But I said I knew if I put that in the color note, the code's going to say you can't do that. It's too, you know, it's too much violence. So I said, so there was no color. I said just color it that way because the code saw the books in black and white. They didn't see the colors when it came out. So, and I don't know if they ever. But I got to tell you my favorite because this is a little more risque. It's funny, when we did the first issue with the Queen of the Black Coast, well, of course, we couldn't have Billy nude from the waist up or anything like that. You have to make a few concessions. But at the end of the story, she does this dance for Cody. Remember? She says she's going to do the mating dance of belief. That's the exact phrase. That was the first thing. Len calls back and calls me up and says, Roy, we can't have this. I says, what do you mean? He said, we can't call it the mating dance of belief. I said, well, you know, I said, look, we gotta get the book out. What would you suggest? He said, how about the love dance of belief? That's pretty insipid, but I said, well, all right, look, we'll do that. He says, but can I ask you a question? Why is love dance okay, mating dance not okay? He says, well, you know, love can be anything, but mating is very specific. So I said, okay, all right. And then the other thing is on the last page, she crawls toward him, and we're sort of looking past her at Conan. She's crawling toward him as she collapses, you know, seductively at the end of the dance. She crawls toward him, he's sitting there, and she crawled, and the drawing was, John just in a drawing, and Conan, she's sort of like in between his legs. His knees stick out one side, the other leg's the other. Says, you got to get rid of one of the legs, because she can't get in between his legs. So we just erased it and put both legs on one side, so you saw like side saddle or something, But the nice thing is, since that book was being done so late, we still had the original art for the original panel. So it was reprinted a couple of years later in black and white, and later every time in color. It's always the original version. We probably left the love dance and delete, but those were the kind of things we did to get past the code. We didn't have too many problems, but when they did, they could be enormous, because Conan was not just it wasn't like the Fantastic Four or something like that. Anyway, unless there's one last question, I'll let you people get to other pursuits. Okay, everybody done? All right. Well, thank you very much.